The eccentricities of the people of Dublin, the Dubliners. Those memories haunted him.
Joyce was a great mixer. People think that he must have been aloof and such a great man.
Hello everybody, this is Rael, and today we will talk about James Joyce, Italo Svevo, Trieste and Dublin. When you watch this video, it will be March 17th, that is St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all those who celebrate. Thus, I wanted to make a video related to Ireland and my personal connection with Ireland and Dublin in particular has to do with literature. When I attended high school, we were taught about Italo Svevo, the day in which the final examination began for my final year of high school. That year, the topic was Italo Svevo, specifically La coscienza di Zeno, Zeno's Conscience, which is his most popular book. And I remember that I wasn't considering doing that kind of essay because we could choose. But since it was Svevo and I knew him so well and all of his work, I felt prepared enough. Actually, it went well. So I was quite fond of Italo Svevo in that sense. But then, during my first year of university, do you call it freshman year? I have no clue. In Italy, it's all different. I attended a couple of classes of English literature just to try them. The professor was deeply involved in everything related to James Joyce in Trieste. Yeah, you can see a couple of clips here from one video that this professor, Laura Pelaschiar, and others made during the pandemic to celebrate Bloomsday.
Naveccia is the term that Joyce uses to refer to this part of the city.
If you happen to wander around the streets of Trieste, you will encounter three main statues. In recent years, they added several more statues that make no sense whatsoever, but for many years we only had these three main statues of writers. These are James Joyce, Italo Svevo and Umberto Saba, who are the three main writers from Trieste, let's say, because even if you talk to the people, to the locals, you will find out that they care a lot about Svevo, Saba and Joyce almost equally. So even though Joyce was not from Trieste, because he came from Dublin, he lived in Trieste for 10 years and he loved the city. He fell in love with the city. So the locals fell in love with Joyce too. But let me go back a little bit and tell you how Joyce ended up in Trieste. Joyce always had a conflicting relationship with Dublin, his hometown, and I can totally relate to that because my hometown is Trieste and I feel the same. As soon as he could, he left his hometown. First he went to Paris to study medicine, then that wasn't his thing. But he wasn't keen on going back to Dublin, although he had to because his mother was ill and he had to go back. For a while, in that period, he started to pick up all those little details on the way to college, and those details you will find later on in his books. So in that period he studied, and then he wasn't a writer yet. He attempted something, but he wasn't published yet. On June 16th, he met Nora Barnacle. They fell in love, and together they left the country, first heading to Zurich, because he had been promised a job over there, teaching in a school. Though when he arrived, there was no job at that school. And so they suggested maybe you should try another one of our schools, which is located in Trieste. And that's how both of them, so James Joyce and Nora Barnacle, arrived in Trieste in 1904, in October. But there was no job there either. And so they were told to move to Pola, where they were about to start a new school. And Pola is a little bit down south in the Istrian Peninsula. But Joyce wasn't happy at all in Pola, he didn't like it. And so as soon as possible, after a few months, they moved back to Trieste. And he met Italo Svevo. At that time, Joyce was teaching English, and Italo Svevo, which actually it's not his name, but we all call it like that because that's his pseudonym and the one that he chose. But you will find in the sources that he's often called Ettore Schmitz, Aaron, Hector Schmitz, several other ways, but it's the same. So Svevo was looking for an English teacher for himself and for his family.
These lessons were very funny because we spoke a little of literature, very little of English language, and discussed very much politics.
And Svevo was 20 years older than Joyce. They pretty much immediately became friends. Joyce was so good at languages, he soon learned and got fluent in the local dialect, which is triestino, Triestine dialect, which was spoken as a lingua franca in Trieste in general. To give you a little bit of a background, ever since 1771, Trieste had a privileged status being the main port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was the second main Mediterranean port after Marseille and the seventh in the entire world. The languages that were spoken in Trieste were different from the rest of the empire because of these special rules that applied to the free port of Trieste. That is, you had this lingua franca among people working in the harbor, so it was more for commercial use and day-to-day life. The language used in bureaucracy was German until a certain point, and then Italian was imposed, because the main language of the area was Italian, since it was the language of the culture in Trieste. And yet, all of these different cultures were living in Trieste at the same time, because being a free port and getting this special status since 1771, there was massive immigration, and the people who moved to Trieste were first the Jews, because they had a special treatment, and peoples of all religions were allowed to practice, which was again another reason why Trieste is so cosmopolitan. So you had Jews coming from all over, then you had people from Greece, from Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, who moved to Trieste to open up their own business. So the languages that were spoken depending on the ethnic groups that moved to Trieste as well. That's why Triestino, Triestine dialect, became the lingua franca, because it's a dialect that comes from Venetian, and Venice and Trieste are just 2 hours from one another by train, so they're very close. And Triestino includes words coming from German, then coming from smaller dialects that used to be spoken or are still spoken in the Istrian Peninsula, and so on. Since James Joyce was so good at learning languages, he pretty much immediately started learning Triestino, and in his own household they started speaking Triestino, because after they moved there they had 2 children, Giorgio and Lucia, both Italian names as you can see, and they used to speak Triestino at home. And so he practiced writing in Triestino and talking in Triestino with Svevo and his family, along with his lessons. I'm not sure about how much you might have heard of this friendship between the two writers, because it's quite obvious and blatant, and you can find information everywhere in Italy about this. Specifically in Trieste, we even have a museum dedicated to this, and again, we have statues, we have a whole itinerary of all the places where Svevo used to live, Joyce used to live, in which cafes they used to go, or for instance, where did one or the other write a specific piece of art. So scattered around the city, you can see these signs. I will show you the pictures that so kindly my mother took in Trieste, because I'm not able to go to Italy right now. So you can see that you can even take a whole walk and explore the city following this itinerary that was the life of James Joyce and Italo Svevo in Trieste. So the two influenced one another, mostly because first, Svevo was already a writer and had already written 2 of his main books, but had been on a very long break. He needed encouragement to keep going. And that's exactly how James Joyce helped. He gave him suggestions, he read his works and encouraged him. Whereas Joyce was barely a writer, or barely published, because only in 1914 Ezra Pound supported the serialized publication of a portrait of an artist as a young man, which was later on published as a book. This means that over those 10 years that James Joyce spent in Trieste, he got ideas and he developed a couple of his works, or even more than that. You might be familiar with Ulysses, and he wrote a few parts of Ulysses in Trieste. He wrote most of Dubliners in Trieste, so remembering what he saw in those years before leaving. And he created the 2 main characters of Ulysses, Leopold and Molly, inspired by his experience with Svevo, because Leopold Bloom is basically Italo Svevo. Joyce liked Trieste for his qualities as a dramatic city with a busy port, which reminded him of Dublin, just like the salty sea smell and the decadence of the harbour and the neighbourhoods around the harbour where he used to live. And he lived in some places that resemble Dublin. In particular, those neighbourhoods in which he noticed the decay of those buildings where rich people used to live and now poor people live, which was the rougher part of the city in Dublin. And the city that he depicted in his works was the dreary Edwardian Dublin. He wasn't able to go back to Dublin and live in Dublin, though he kept talking or writing about Dublin, because he couldn't help it. He needed to talk about Dublin. And that's a little bit how I feel about Trieste. I cannot live peacefully in Trieste. I always feel this urge to leave and go somewhere else. But I totally get the essence of the city, this melancholy, this... Yes, it's decadent. And let me tell you, when I was searching for images and video clips to show you, I noticed something that truly bothered me about my own city. Just as Joyce left the city and went back visiting a few times, after the 1920s, after the war, he wasn't able to recognize the city anymore. Well, that's something that I can feel as well, because, well, there hasn't been a war, there has been the pandemic since I moved out of the country, but still I can notice, even after a few years, how different the city feels and looks like. And what truly bothers me is that the neighborhood where prostitutes used to be and the people working in the port used to live, which was one of the areas where Joyce and Svevo spent a lot of time. When I was a kid, it used to be a scary place. You would avoid that area because it was it felt dangerous. So when I was a kid, I remember that. Then, probably when I was a teenager, they started renovating the entire neighborhood, which is at the base of the old town. And so they started cleaning up and renovating the buildings. And over the past 15 years or so, it has been the heart of the city. So everything is new and these bars are inviting and there's people around. It's quite lively. And yet, when I saw these videos that were shot over the past 2 years, all I could see was vandalism, this decay of the city, and I'm surprised that nobody has done anything about it. It's a very popular area, and yet it feels unsafe and dirty and dreary, just as Dublin used to feel like for Joyce. Personally, I'm just disappointed, disgusted, and I cannot see why the local government has to spend the money building new statues instead of cleaning up the city and making sure that it's safe. So I can totally get the disappointment that Joyce felt and why he couldn't go back home. He wasn't able to go back home. And then after Trieste, he moved to Switzerland and to Paris, so he kept living somewhere else. In Paris, that's where his work, Ulysses, was finally published, because there was censorship and so many issues, but you can find information about Ulysses everywhere. I don't want to focus on that, but funny enough, I had no clue about this part of his life, because probably I forgot about it, but when he was in Paris, he befriended the owner of Shakespeare and Co.
I was very much impressed with Joyce. I thought I'd never seen anyone so interesting and so fine.
At first, she was just a bookseller,
as we called it. Joyce was the great star of the crowd, and we had this crowd. We knew all the young American writers at that time because they were all abroad. It was Prohibition, and they couldn't get Ulysses. I used to think those were the two causes of their discontent.
When Ulysses wasn't being published, James Joyce talked to her.
And I think how annoying not to be able to get it anymore. And it was being suppressed in a review.
He asked for help. She decided to publish it herself. So even before having a publishing company.
I said to him, "Would you like me to publish Ulysses?" And he said, "I would."
When I lived in Paris for a few months, I visited Shakespeare and Co, which nowadays it's one of the most popular bookshops to visit because of Instagram and social media and so on. Even though you cannot take pictures inside, so you just have to enjoy it. I went there on a Monday morning or something. When I went upstairs, I sat down in one of the rooms where they had a piano. I found a little book by Edgar Allan Poe, which is one of my favorite authors. I read The Telltale Heart again, and while I was reading, there were an old lady and a boy who came in, a guy. He just sat at the piano and he started playing. She was so moved by that moment. After he played once, he was about to leave, and she asked him to stay and to keep playing the piano for us. So I stayed also, quietly reading my book. Then I left with this one. Although James Joyce was not exactly a role model because he was a drunk, he was so bad with money that's also one of the reasons why they kept moving houses. He was indebted, and it must not have been an easy life for his family either. You can say that James Joyce exiled himself from his homeland, and despite that, he celebrated Dublin and his homeland his entire life through his work. And so I found this topic to be fitting for St. Patrick's Day, Even though it would have been even better to do it on June 16th when Bloomsday is celebrated, so this is related to Ulysses. But that's a specific thing, whereas it has to do just with Ulysses. Whereas I wanted to show you this connection between the two cities of Dublin and Trieste, how they are connected and how in a way they look alike and they feel similar and even smell similar, how Joyce felt in the two cities, how Svevo impacted his life and vice versa, and how all of this has to do with me, because they affected my life too. They are a huge part of the local culture in Trieste. I think every single soul can tell you something about either Svevo or Joyce. And nowadays tourists just take a picture with the statue and they're happy about it, but there's so much more about it. There's so much more about their story, their lives, and how this cosmopolitan city and this peculiar city, because it has very little to do with the other Italian cities, especially if you look up the architecture. Yes, you can see the same Roman structure of the city, but the architecture is austro-hungarian mainly. But it's a wounded city, just as Dublin seems to be in Joyce's writing, and it's bittersweet. Both cities feel bittersweet. And I've been to Dublin a few years back, just for a few days, but I visited Joyce's museum and I felt this connection. I don't know if it's related to this, but I've always been very attached to Ireland and to their music, especially to their music. Did you know about this friendship, this deep connection between Svevo and Joyce? Or are you just familiar with Joyce? Have you ever had the courage to read Ulysses? Have you ever visited Trieste? I want to know about that, and I want to know about your experience visiting that city. For today's episode, actually, I changed the background, and that's Trieste, how it used to look like. Not at its best, but almost. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please like, share, subscribe. And if you want to be notified whenever I upload a new one, you can just click the notification bell, and I will see you in the next one.